Ok, chicos, ¿cómo están? Buenos días. Siguiendo con las charlas de la JConf Perú 2020, tengo el placer de presentarlos a nuestro querido amigo Reza Rahman, que nos va a acompañar el día de hoy con esta charla. Un poquito para contarles la experiencia que tiene Reza a lo largo de esos años dentro de las comunidades. Reza Rahman es el administrador principal de programas de Java en Azure, en Microsoft. Él trabaja para asegurarse de que los desarrolladores de Java sean ciudadanos de primera clase en Microsoft y que Microsoft también sea un ciudadano de primera clase para el ecosistema Java. Reza ha sido tecnólogo oficial de Java en Oracle. Es autor del popular libro EJB3 en acción. Además, ha sido durante mucho tiempo un orador frecuente en muchos grupos de usuarios en Java y conferencias en todo el mundo, incluidos Java One y DevOps. Además, ha sido ganador del premio Java One Rockstar Speaker y es un ávido colaborador de la revista de las industrias como Java Lobby o DOSNT and the Server Side. Ha sido miembro de los grupos de expertos de Java EE, JB y JMS a lo largo de los años. También implementó el contenedor EJB para el servidor de aplicaciones Java EE de código abierto de Reza. Actualmente, Reza ayuda a liderar el grupo de usuarios de Java en la ciudad de Filadelfia, en Estados Unidos. Reza, it is a pleasure to see you. We listen to you.
All right, great. So let's get the talk started. So today's talk is about how Microsoft learned to love Java. To be honest, it's a talk I wasn't expecting to give probably even about a few years ago. So it's my pleasure to do this talk. I think doing this talk alone tells you how much things have really changed at Microsoft and the Java community. So a reasonable question to ask is why that is. And in fact, the answer is can be explained in a single graph. This is the TOB Programming Index. Hopefully, most of you are familiar with this. It's taking a long-range view of what is going on in the ecosystem with regards to the popular programming languages. And as you can see, as Java developers, we really are in a position of privilege because Java really is the most popular language by far. And it's a language that Microsoft obviously has not always supported well. But these are the dynamics behind why a platform that, like Azure, that is supposed to be very inclusive and empower everyone, why a platform like Azure really needs to work hard. And it does work hard to enable Java developers to be successful on it. And in fact, I would say that all in all, Microsoft is on Azure is probably doing much more to support Java developers than most of the other cloud vendors, primary cloud vendors, and you'll see why. You'll see why by yourself when I talk about all of the different things that we are doing to enable Java developers on Azure. So this all started actually not that long ago. Believe it or not, Java on Azure is not that old of an endeavor. So it's about 5 years old. But I think we've really made some significant progress in these 5 years, and I think it already shows the kind of work that we are doing. So this is another gentleman that actually started all of this. His name is Brian Benz, and this was a talk some time ago delivered in DevOps. And I'm actually providing another rendition, a more up-to-date rendition of this talk today, talking about a lot more. So between now and then, really our efforts to embrace Java developers has enhanced significantly. So there's many different ways as a Java developer you want to be able to embrace the cloud and embrace Azure. And basically our objective is to make sure that whatever pathway you take and whatever your technology choices are, whether it's Java, whether it's Java EE, or whether it's Spring, whatever your pathway, whatever your choice of technology, that you are enabled to do what you need to do on Azure. In fact, this is a good representation of the kind of things that we do for Java developers today. And obviously, we'll spend a lot of time talking about exactly what these things mean in a bit more detail. But I want to give you basically a high-level view of this. So whether you're choosing VMs or containers or managed services, we basically represent a large majority of the Java ecosystem, whether that's Java SE, Linux, Docker, Kubernetes, Tomcat, Jboss, WebLogic, WebSphere, OpenShift, Spring, whatever you happen to be using, you are well supported on Azure. Okay. So the other thing to understand is that it also doesn't matter what architecture you choose. So just like whatever pathway you choose, whatever your platform of choice is, whether it's virtual machines or containers, or whether it's Java, EE, or Spring, similarly, it also does not matter what your architecture is. You could be having a monolith. You could bring that to Azure very easily. You could have a full-blown, fine-grained set of microservices that you want to bring Azure. You're also able to do that, and everything in between. And in fact, you can evolve your application on Azure once you bring it in on board. For example, you could start with a journey as a monolith, and then you can containerize it with Docker and Kubernetes, and you can go all the way to full-blown, fine-grained microservices. So whatever it is that wherever you are in your journey, Azure here is to support you as a Java developer. So let's talk about the different pathways for moving to Azure. We'll talk about each of the pathways a little bit and talk about how Azure enables you for that particular pathway. So first and foremost is virtual machines. So virtual machines is probably the oldest and most familiar way of moving to the cloud. This is basically just like your data center on somebody else's machine. It's not very different, perhaps, from what you have on-premise today in terms of its developer experience. So Azure has long enabled Java developers specifically by enabling Linux virtual machines to run on Java developers. And in fact, today, almost more than half of machines that run on Azure are actually Linux virtual machines. And a large majority of that, in fact, are Java developers. So aside from enabling all of the major flavors of Linux, what we also do is we have something called the Azure Marketplace that also offers virtual machine solutions. So you can think of these as sort of pre-built images and pre-built solutions to help you onboard very easily onto virtual machines. And we also have a lot of those, and those are all representing the Java ecosystem extremely well. So we have on the Java SE side, we have solution templates and images for Zulu. We have solutions for OpenJDK. On the Java EE side, of course, we have Tomcat. We also have Jboss and WebLogic and WebSphere as very, very robust virtual machine offerings. In fact, we're working with, right at this moment, my team is working with Red Hat to enable Jboss, Oracle to enable WebLogic, and IBM to enable WebSphere in a very powerful way on Azure virtual machines. Again, you have a whole set of data services. Whatever database you want to choose, you're in good shape. You have SQL Server, Postgres, Oracle, even MongoDB, Redis, Hadoop, whatever your data platform is, there is either a virtual machine or a solution template to support you. Same thing with messaging, and same thing with DevOps tools like Jenkins, Splunk, Elastic, whatever you may choose as your DevOps platform, there is an option for you in the marketplace to enable moving into virtual machines. So another interesting phenomena that is happening today is all these multi-cloud platforms, right? So basically a multi-cloud platform allows you to have the same sort of experience from one cloud to the other. So they offer an abstraction layer above the cloud platform providers. And it also provides some consistency between on-premise workloads and cloud, right? So you can run things like OpenShift or VMware Tanzu in your data center as well as on the cloud, and it basically provides you a seamless experience, a seamless hybrid cloud experience if you do so. So Azure works very hard to enable these multi-cloud platforms and enable integration with them. In particular, we have a strong partnership with Red Hat to have a managed OpenShift environment. Similarly, we also work with VMware to have a managed Tanzu server offering as well. So if you happen to choose these platforms, again, you're well supported as a Java developer on Azure with either of these choices. Now, at the end of the day, actually, both VMware Tanzu and OpenShift work on Kubernetes, right? So Kubernetes is hugely popular. It is perhaps the most popular way of doing containerization and container orchestration on the cloud and even on-premise. Similarly, you could be running Kubernetes on-premise and on the cloud, and it also provides a level of consistency. It's something in between a virtual machine and sort of the PaaS platform. I think of it as like do it yourself PaaS platform, if you will. So Azure has extremely strong support for Kubernetes. We have one of the leading Kubernetes implementations running in a managed fashion on Azure, and that is the Azure Kubernetes service. It is very, very well supported and very, very robust. It has a bunch of features built into it, all the way from Kubernetes common features like resiliency and and horizontal scaling, all the way up to manageability and file storage, NFS integration, security integration, a bunch of very, very robust features built into the Azure Kubernetes service. We also have a registry to go along with that. It's called Azure Container Registry. Now, let's say for a second that you don't want to use Kubernetes and you just want to use containers and Docker. Well, there's another solution on Azure for that as well. It's called Azure Container Instances that simply allows you to use Docker to move into the cloud without necessarily needing to use a full-scale orchestration platform. This is useful if your application is not really that complex, or only a part of your application needs to be containerized rather than the entire application itself. So it's definitely worth taking a look at. And these are, again, things that you can utilize as a Java developer on Azure. Lastly, one of the strongest points for Azure is managed services, or PaaS, right? So if somebody really asks me, hey, what is the number one reason as a developer I should be excited about Azure? This is actually the reason, is because we have a very broad set of managed services around the ecosystem, especially around Java, as you'll see in a second. So this is the highest level of abstraction possible, where you don't want to deal with infrastructure level concerns. You don't have to deal with operating system level concerns or software level concerns. Really, what you're concerned here is your deployment unit. In your case, either a jar or var or ear file. And all you want to do is deploy that solution on Azure, and you don't have to do anything else other than go through a wizard and get these instances up and running. So this is probably provides the greatest ease of use. In many cases, we provide Java-specific runtimes, and in many other cases, what we do is we provide best-of-breed software from Microsoft and provide Java bindings for those services. So this is a good representation of how that is. So in terms of applications, the premier platform for doing managed services on Azure is something called the app service. So the app service provides support for Java SE. So it provides a managed version of Zulu. It provide for Tomcat in a managed fashion, and it also provides support for Jboss EAP and as a managed server offering for users that want to use Java EE. Now, in addition to that, there is also another option called Spring Cloud Service that I'll talk about in a second, and that is also another managed service that you can use in addition to app services. So if you have very simple Spring Boot applications, probably the most logical place you want to go is App Service Zulu, so App Service Java SE, and run your bootable jars there. But let's say you're developing industrial grade microservices, and you need microservices level features and services. That's where Spring Cloud comes in, and we'll talk about Spring Cloud in a second as well. In terms of data, you have, again, a whole bunch of data services that we already talked about, things like SQL Server, Postgres, MySQL, MariaDB. These are all provided as managed services, and they all integrate extremely well through things like JDBC and JPA for Java developers. In addition to that, let's say you want to use NoSQL. So you want to use, let's say, MongoDB or Cassandra or Gremlin. So Cosmos DB is the solution for that. So Cosmos DB is a managed NoSQL service built on Azure that provides all of these bindings that Java developers can use. So you can use it with, for example, Spring Data, or you can use it with Jakarta NoSQL, and it will do the bindings through all of those popular APIs like MongoDB and Cassandra and Gremlin and the like. Similarly, we have a managed Redis offering that you can use in Java in Java applications through JCache. Now, beyond this, we also have support for things like application insights. So this is kind of like Elk. We also have a managed Elk service, by the way. You can use a managed Elk service on Azure if you so wish. But application insights is basically the more Microsoft-centric native built-in solution for doing things like monitoring and log aggregation. And App Insights has bindings for most of the logging APIs out there, whether you're using Log4j or util logging, whatever you happen to be using. App Insights has bindings to be able to aggregate those logs from Java applications. Similarly, Azure DevOps is sort of the solution, Microsoft solution to Jenkins. So we don't have a managed Jenkins offering on Azure, but we do have managed Azure DevOps, and Azure DevOps has a number of features that actually make the Java developer experience for DevOps on Azure extremely easy. So it's definitely a worthy product to take a look at in terms of managed services for Java developers on Azure. Other than that, we have blob storage. This is a way of storing binary data. Key Vault for managing your secrets, managing your configuration, application configuration in a safe way. For example, this will work with Spring configuration. Blob storage also will work the similar way. Active Directory has a bunch of different integrations, either with Java EE application servers via LDAP, or through Spring, or through JWT. Right? So those are all possibilities that you can use as a Java developer on Azure. Service Bus, similarly, this is our messaging platform, and it has a different Java bindings. It has a native Java binding, its own Java API. It has bindings for Spring, and it also has bindings for JMS, for Java EE users. Similar type of story for Event Hub and Event Grid. In each of these types of services, there is almost always at least a proprietary Java API that you can use specific to that product. You can use that in a Java SE environment, for example. If you're using Spring, there's going to be a Spring binding for those APIs. And in many cases, there will also be a Java EE binding, things like JDBC, JMS, JPA, JCache, and the like. Okay. So Spring developers are particularly well supported on Azure today. So as we talked about, for each of these services that are in Spring, there's usually a Java binding and a Azure service that you can bind to. So there's a listing of that. Feel free to take a look at that if you are a Spring developer. I'll share my deck with you a little bit later, so you can definitely take a look at the deck yourself, after the fact, and explore all of these options by yourself as well. So we talked about the Spring Cloud service. So let's talk a little bit more around it. So this is a service that was co-built with VMware to help support Spring developers on Azure. So what this allows you to do is deploy these Spring Boot applications in a resilient way under the hood. This is using Kubernetes, but you don't have access. You don't necessarily need to worry about the Kubernetes layer. Basically, this is a PaaS application. You just deploy your Spring Boot jar file, and you're good to go. And there's a whole bunch of services built around Spring Boot and Spring Cloud as well. So this provides implementations of the circuit breakers in Spring Cloud, application registries, API gateway, Spring configuration server, distributed tracing. So all of those features that you need in a microservices environment, all of that is actually baked into this platform, and you can just consume it instead of needing to spin up infrastructure, needing to manage these pieces yourself. This is all provided as managed services on Spring. For Java EE developers, you similarly have the Jboss EAP offering that is also a PaaS. So it provides the equivalent in terms of Java EE applications, and this is more specific to Spring developers. Okay, so aside from that, serverless is also a big thing these days, right? So serverless is basically a way of minimum way of deploying functionality into the cloud. So basically, all you're doing is just running your code. So you don't have deployable jars. You certainly don't have infrastructure. Literally, you can almost just take your Java code and run it, and that's it. You don't need to worry about any other framework or what have you. And for Azure, the platform that provides the serverless support is called Azure Functions. And Azure Functions has excellent support for Java. Right now, it has previous support for Java 11. The mainline support is still for Java SE 8, but basically you can deploy your Java code directly into Azure Functions. It has all of the bindings, all of the capabilities built in there to allow it. There's also another bit of code in our serverless offering on Azure. It's called Logic Apps. So you can think of Logic Apps sort of as ESBs for serverless. So it provides a bunch of declarative things like a routing, filtering, pooling, and the like. And that again has support for Java binding. So you can deploy Azure Functions in Java and then wire them up together and route them sort of in an old school system integration way using Logic Apps. Okay. So one other thing that we always run into is our customers asking us, hey, I want a supported Java SE version, right? I want LTS support. I don't know if I'm going to get it from some other vendor like Oracle. What can you do for me? Can you provide a long-term supported Java version? And the answer in Azure is absolutely yes, right? And the way we do that is we have a partnership with Azure Systems. Azure Systems provides a very, very excellent implementation of OpenJDK called Zulu. So if you are an Azure user, you get free LTS versions, free support, commercial support for Zulu, as long as you are deploying to Azure. So you're deploying either via virtual machines or Kubernetes or even, let's say, Azure Functions. As long as you are using any of those things, you get free supported version of Zulu. You can call up Azure Systems and say, hey, I'm an Azure user. I want commercial support for my JDK, and you're good to go. Similarly, if you happen to be using it on a machine that will ultimately deploy to Azure, you also have support, full support for supported versions of Zulu. And all of the major versions of OpenJDK are supported, whether it's 7, 8, or 11. You're well supported on Azure. We're working on support for 13 right now. It's preview support yet, so as soon as we solidify that, you'll also have support for the latest and greatest Zulu version, latest and greatest Java version on Azure in a fully supported fashion, in a fully commercially supported fashion. Okay, so that is about the runtimes that Azure provides. Aside from all these runtimes, you can also actually have supported versions of tools, right? So there's a number of tools that you can use on Azure to be able to use your Java applications. So we'll take a look at a little bit of that story now. Okay, so you can have DevOps tools. So there's a number of tools that Java developers tend to use over and over again. These are things like Maven, Jenkins, Terraform, these sorts of things. And in all of those cases, we at Azure provide you basically specialized services around these things, right? So we have a set of Maven plugins, right? For each of those tools that we develop, we always have a Maven plugin. App Service is a pretty good example of that. We provide binding support for Jenkins, right? So if you're running Jenkins and you want to integrate with Azure, you want to deploy to Azure resources, you're going to spin up Azure resources, that is also possible. We provide full support for Terraform, right? So if you're doing your Java deployments using Terraform, you are well supported there as well. We already talked about Azure DevOps. Again, we don't, for Azure DevOps, that is the natively supported version, a DevOps tool that's built into Azure. Again, that has native support for Java. Now, let's say for a second that none of these things are good enough for you, and you're using something like Ant or some other proprietary DevOps tool. What do you do then? Or if you want to create your own extensions to Terraform, well, you can do that using the Azure SDK. And the Azure SDK provides you basically the lowest possible level access to do Azure functionality on Azure. So you can use the Azure Java SDK and write Java programs to do whatever you want on Azure. It's the lowest level access possible. Okay, so we also have excellent IDE support. Speaking of tools, this has always been a strong point for Microsoft, as many of you probably know. We don't have support for Java in Visual Studio quite yet, but we do have VS Code, and VS Code has excellent support for Java. So feel free to take a look at the Java support in VS Code. That is basically our commitment to the Java IDE ecosystem right at this moment. But other than that, let's say you're using IntelliJ or Eclipse. Even in that case, we provide Azure plugins for IntelliJ and Eclipse, especially the support is very, very robust for things like IntelliJ. So this will provide support for integration with the Azure resources, deploying to things like Azure Functions, let's say, and the like, and be able to also monitor some resources as well. So feel free to take a look at all of that. There's a bunch of capabilities built into it, especially for VS Code. We have a bunch of capabilities available now and evolving in the future to better support Java developers, both on Azure and also outside of Azure. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some solution samples, right, and see how that looks like. So let me see, did I skip a slide here? Not quite. Okay, so let's talk about solution samples, and let's put all of these things a little bit together and see how they look like when you put them all together. So let's talk about, for example, our WebLogic offering. So in case of WebLogic, we have a solution template that we work on with Oracle, and this solution template allows you to just point and click very easily and be able to create a very robust WebLogic deployments, whether it's single instance, whether it's a cluster, whether it's a dynamic cluster. You can very easily create that on Azure virtual machines. Now, aside from doing that, what the solution template also offers is that it provides out-of-the-box integration with other parts of Azure. So let's say you want to have a WebLogic cluster, but you want to front-end it with a load balancer. So one of the most robust load balancing solutions on Azure is the Azure App Gateway. And the Azure App Gateway out-of-the-box will work with the solution templates that we're working with Oracle, and it integrates automatically. Similarly, we will have integration support for Elastic, right? So you can take your WebLogic logs and ship it out to Elastic. You could have support for an Oracle Coherence cluster to back up your WebLogic cluster. And finally, you could integrate with various sets of databases, such as maybe running Oracle database on virtual machines on Azure. Now, you could deploy all of this using the Maven plugins that we have built in for Azure that allow you to deploy virtual machines onto Azure. You could be deploying this from Jenkins, triggering your build from GitHub, and using Eclipse as your IDE. So this is just one solution sample. Let's say, for example, that you're not a WebLogic developer and you're using Spring Boot. And in this example, let's say you want to deploy Spring Boot not to Spring Cloud. As we talked about, Spring Cloud is a very good option to do these sorts of things. But let's say you don't want to deploy on Spring Cloud. You want to deploy this on the AKS or Azure Container service, and you're able to do that, right? There's robust support for you to do that. But beyond that, you could be front-ending it with another even more robust load balancing solution on Azure called the Traffic Manager. And the Traffic Manager will allow for disaster recovery options. So you could have Kubernetes clusters across 2 different regions, right? So if one region were to fail, the Traffic Manager will reroute the request to another region. Or if you want to, let's say, have customers in Europe and customers in South America, well, the Traffic Manager is smart enough to figure out that, hey, the South American customers should go to the South America region, and let's say the European customers need to go to my European data center deployment of Azure Kubernetes service. Again, we have strong built-in support for Active Directory for Spring. So you could use Spring Security and integrate very well with things like Active Directory. You could integrate with things like App Insights. You could have Spring bindings for speaking to Cosmos DB through Spring Data, MongoDB, let's say. You can use Spring Data with MySQL, manage MySQL, in this case on Azure. You could integrate Spring configuration into Key Vault. All of those capabilities are built in. You could be doing the deployment through the Azure Container Registry, through Azure DevOps, from GitHub, from, in this case, let's say, IntelliJ as your ID. Now, if you don't want to do any of that and you want to do PaaS, and PaaS is your platform of choice, and this is what you would like to do, you're able to do that as well. right? So let's say you in this case you're a Java EE user and you want to use Jboss. Well, you can do that because the app service, again, the PaaS platform of choice on Azure, has support for Jboss, right? So you could be deploying just point and click and saying, hey, I want 5 instances of Jboss, and it would just be up and running for you and ready to deploy your WAR file or EAR file. Again, you could be using Traffic Manager as your load balancing solution in front of app service. You could be integrating via LDAP. You could be integrating your Jboss app server with LDAP via LDAP with Azure Active Directory. Again, you have a managed version of that. You could be integrating to Elastic, Service Bus via JMS, Postgres SQL via Hibernate, Key Vault, Redis Cache via Jcache. Again, doing the deployment via Maven. You could be running Jenkins on Azure as a virtual machine solution template. Again, we don't have a PaaS, but we do have a virtual machine solution template for Jenkins. Again, you could be using some combination of GitHub or IntelliJ. Finally, let's say you want to develop serverless applications using Java on Azure. So you want to use Azure Functions. You could be deploying directly from VS Code from Java. So VS Code from Java has a Azure Functions binding. So you could be using that binding to deploy your Azure Functions directly into Azure, let's say even from your IDE, to keep things very, very lightweight. That's a very typical scenario for serverless. If you're doing some kind of prototyping, you can do that. So you don't need a build system at all. You can deploy directly from the IDE. And let's say you could have as complex of a scenario as you see here. So each of these little functions could be written, executing little bits of Java code here and there. You can have logic apps pulling from, let's say, blob storage, let's say images. So you can have complicated logic in your logic apps to say, hey, if this is an image of this type, send it to this function. If this is an image of this type, send it to this other function, and have all of these functions trigger for you. Perhaps going to Cosmos DB, storing via MongoDB and being pulled up into a web app running on, let's say, Tomcat or Jboss EAP. You could be sending out a JMS message on Azure Service Bus that picked up by a Spring Boot application or a Tomcat application or a Jboss EAP application. You could be sending out an SMS message via Twilio. And Azure Functions has a integration built in with Twilio in order for you to do that as well. Okay. So to put all of this together, I actually have put together a demo application. So I won't show you the demo application quite yet because I don't think we'll have enough time to go over it today. Normally, I do this demo application in an hour-long talk, so we don't have an hour. But I do want to show you what this is. So let's open up the application here. This is on GitHub, and as you can see, you can take a look at this application yourself. But the idea here is to give you step-by-step instructions on how to get up and running with a Java application. In this case, it's going to be a wildfly-based application using Postgres and Azure. So in this example, I'll be using the Azure Kubernetes service, or AKS. So this will be a cluster deployment of AKS. And it'll give you step-by-step directions on how to set all of these things up so that you can actually deploy this application and get it up and running. So I'll show you the bits and pieces of Java code that I have here. Actually, let me walk you through the instructions first. So this is an Azure Cafe application. It's a Java EE application. It's just a CRUD application. In this case, you will need a GitHub account to do this. You will need an Azure subscription, and you can get a free Azure subscription. So if you click here, you'll get a 1-year free Azure subscription to be able to evaluate Azure, and you'll be able to do majority of these things using that free subscription. You will need a Docker Hub account for this example. You can use the Azure Container Registry if you want, but in this case, I chose to use Docker Hub. And you will need an Azure DevOps account. So I'm showing you in this case Azure DevOps. So this is again the DevOps platform, similar to Jenkins for Java developers. And you can get a free account for that as well and be able to do your builds without paying anything at all. In this case, we want to start a managed Postgres instance. So let me log onto Azure and show you a little bit of it. So you can actually type in, create a resource, and you can type in Postgres. And you have all these different Postgres instances that you can run on Azure very easily. So this provides you all those managed services for databases. Let me show you that. Okay, your databases. So this is a managed service from Microsoft to support Postgres developers. So you can create a managed service just by following these steps. You can create an Azure Kubernetes cluster. So you go to here and create a resource, and then if you go to containers, this is the Azure Kubernetes service. Right. Again, you can point and click and create a Kubernetes service very easily. You can set up the Kubernetes tooling on your desktop. You can set up application insights to be able to run this application via Azure Insights, and then you can finally do Azure DevOps and actually deploy the application really quickly. So let me run through a little bit of the code, if you will. So I'll show you the Docker file that I'm deploying. So as you can see, let me increase the font size a little bit. Okay, so as you can see, I'm running the Jboss Wildfly image right in my Docker file. I'm going to basically deploy a Postgres jar file and deploy my application. This is my application. This is my WAR file that I'm trying to deploy. The source code for that is there. So as you can see, there's some configuration for Jboss, the standalone configuration, and you'll be able to deploy your Docker image that way. Here's the code itself. So the code is actually very simple. So if you go on to the POM file, you'll see that this is nothing much more than a very simple Java EE application. Okay, so it's using, in fact, Java EE 8, if I remember correctly. Yeah, Java EE 8 to deploy the application. So it's just a Maven-based application that you can build, and I give you the instructions on how to do that. And this is the Kubernetes descriptor here. So you can use the Kubernetes descriptor to deploy this application onto Kubernetes. So feel free to take a look at this. Feel free to follow these step-by-step instructions and actually deploy the application onto Azure. Okay. So I do want to leave a little bit of time to talk for Q&A. Again, Microsoft is very serious about Java. I think we're doing more with Java developers, especially with our partnership ecosystem with Azure Systems, VMware, Red Hat, IBM, Oracle, than basically any other major cloud platform out there. There's many different ways. We know that the Java ecosystem is diverse. There's Spring developers, there's Java EE developers, there's all sorts of other architectures and different pathways to move into Azure. We are working to enable all of those pathways for you, whether it's virtual machines or container or managed batch services, serverless, or whatever you happen to be using. We're also providing all of the tooling, including commercial support for the JDK, so that you have a very good experience, a very robust experience on Azure as Java developers. And of course, all of this is evolving, right? So you can engage with us and really talk about what is the things that you would like to see as a Java developer from Microsoft, and we're very happy to support you in that way as well. Okay, so I'll leave you with a few resources. I believe I have only about 2 minutes, then we need to move into Q&A. So these are some of the resources I'll leave you with. So take a look at the Azure landing page. That has a few resources, higher level resources for Java developers. We have a bunch of different docs for Java developers on Azure, and we also have various official Azure samples. Aside from the GitHub sample that I showed you, there's a bunch of other samples geared towards Java developers on Azure. You can take a look at all of those and begin to see what are all of the things you can do with Azure. And of course, you have my GitHub sample. You can feel free to start there as well. I think that's a very logical place for many people to start. So I think that is all the time that I have. I'll take some Q&A. We have about 5 minutes of Q&A. So let me stop. Actually, I won't stop sharing my screen. I'll just take any Q&A. Miriam, please ask me if there's any other questions, and I'll try to answer them. I think we have about 5 more minutes to do Q&A right now.
Okay. Your question. Ok. ¿Alguna pregunta por ahí? Ok. Aún tenemos Reza, you have 3 minutes more.
Okay, so Miriam, do you have is there any questions for me to answer?
No, Reza.
Okay, so I think it's okay. We'll give 3 minutes back to people. I really appreciate your time, and you have a good day and stay safe. And I'll talk to you tomorrow. I have a couple of other talks tomorrow, so feel free to please join me for the other talks. I believe it's 1 in the morning, 11 a.m. Eastern Standard. I think for you guys that is 12. And then I also have another talk at 3 p.m. tomorrow, all talking about different aspects of Azure. One is going to be about Java EE developers on Azure, in particular, how they are supported in the different pathways that they have on Azure. And then I have another talk specifically talking about one piece that I mentioned today, which is Cosmos DB, and how do you use Cosmos DB as a Java EE developer using a new standard called Jakarta NoSQL. In fact, I believe my good friend Otavio Santana will be having a talk just focused on Jakarta NoSQL as well. So I think that's all for me for today. I'll talk to you guys tomorrow. Hopefully, you'll have more questions for me tomorrow. Miriam, I really appreciate it. I think we're good to go for now.
Okay, Reza. Thank you. It was a pleasure to see you. And thank you very much for being with us today, Reza. Thank you.
My pleasure. Talk to you guys soon.
Reza, okay, bye.
Bye for now.